The wind came off the hills like a living thing, hard, hungry, and mean, driving needles of ice through Riverbend Creek and along the clapboard face of the one-room schoolhouse. Inside, Clara Carrington rubbed a ghost of chalk from the slate as if it mattered, as if one more clean board could hold back the evening. The last of her pupils had gone an hour ago, 2 by 2 into the whitening street scarves trailing like small flags, and still she lingered with her shawl unbuttoned, pretending to tidy, pretending the room needed her. It didn't. The truth was simpler and colder. She was not ready to walk home to a house that answered no one. 6 months a widow, 3 months unpaid, and one blizzard away from being a name, the church ladies said softly. Clara wrapped the shawl at last and stepped out. Snow grabbed at her skirts. Each footfall sank to the ankle and held as if the road itself wished to keep her. The lantern in her mittened hand blew thin and skittish. Its light made a narrow tunnel through the weather and nothing more. She counted the doors she passed. Mr. Talbot's blacksmith shop shuttered tight. Mrs. Chen's cafe, one dim lamp breathing behind curtained glass, and told herself the counting helped. It didn't, not really, but it gave the wind something to argue with. By the time she reached her cabin, her fingers had gone to wood. The key slipped twice, skittering across the stoop before she trapped it with the heel of her boot. Inside, the air met her like a stranger, formal, unsympathetic, unheated. The hearth was a black grin. She set the lantern down and stood very still, drawing breath, until the ache settled into its usual shape. James's coat hung where she had left it on the peg, by the door sleeves, empty collar turned toward the room the way his head used to turn when she spoke. She touched the wool with the back of her hand as if it might be hot, and then let it fall. No wood. No coin for wood until the county paid, if the county paid. She knelt at the firebox anyway, coaxing at old ash with a scrap of kindling, making the motions of warmth, though there was nothing to feed. The cabin ticked as the storm pressed its knuckles into the seams. Outside, something banged once, and then was taken by the gale. The knock, when it came, was a single measured beat on the door. Not the wind, not a branch. A knuckle. Clara went still, one hand finding the pistol above the mantel, and the other steadying the lantern. "Who is it?" she called, voice even. A man's voice answered through the wood, low and unhurried. "Name's Thomas. From South Ridge. I've brought fire." Snow still rattled the shutters when Clara pulled open the door. A man stood there, framed in the storm, his hat heavy with ice, his coat powdered white, and a canvas sack of chopped wood balanced against one arm. He looked larger than the doorway itself, yet not imposing, only steady, as if the weather dared not move him. "Thomas Rohr," he said simply, "from South Ridge. I heard you'd run out of wood. Thought maybe we could trade fire for supper." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. Pride had kept her upright when grief and hunger might have buckled her. But the cold in her cabin was not something pride could fight. She stepped aside without a word, and Thomas crossed the threshold. He set the sack by the hearth and knelt as if it were his own home. Kindling clicked, a match flared, and in moments a thin flame took hold, licking slowly at the darkness. Clara stood stiff, a few paces back, arms crossed. She had watched him that week near the schoolhouse, a figure on horseback at the edge of town. "You've been watching me," she said flatly. Thomas didn't deny it. "Wanted to see how long you'd last." Her spine stiffened. "I don't need saving." He met her eyes, then his face softened by the rising glow. "I didn't say you did, but I know what it feels like to keep standing when winter wants you buried." The words settled heavier than the silence. She asked, almost against her will, "Why come tonight?" He leaned back on his heels. "Because the storm out there will swallow this valley whole, and because I'd rather not see a good woman freeze for the sake of pride." Clara's throat tightened. No one had called her good in months, maybe years. She busied her hands with bread broth, the remnants of her cupboard. They ate facing the fire. The bread was stale, the broth thin, but Thomas made no complaint. Instead, he spoke of cattle trails, wolves in the high country, and the brother he had buried after the war. He told her without flourish of a wife lost to fever. Clara found herself listening as if each word stoked the fire further. She offered none of her own stories. He didn't press. When he rose to leave, he stacked the unused wood neatly and set a small parcel on the table. "Flour, coffee, wedge of cheese," he said. "No pity. Just fair trade for supper." The door opened on a world gone white. Wind screamed like some wounded thing. Thomas stepped into it without hesitation, shoulders squared. Clara closed the door behind him, the latch clicking into place. The cabin was different now. The fire burned warm and steady, and in its glow, the silence no longer felt like an enemy. Her hands, she realized, were no longer shaking. She sat in the rocker, the parcel still on the table. And for the first time in many weeks, Clara let herself believe that maybe the storm would pass, and she would be there to see the morning. The storm had grown crueler by the day, until even the bravest families kept their doors bolted. Yet Clara Carrington still trudged each morning to the one-room schoolhouse, scarf pulled, high boots sinking into drifts. By Friday, her classroom, once noisy with 20 children, held only 3 small figures. Mary Goodwin sat quietly in the front row, her father at home with a broken leg. Polly Talbot fidgeted in boots too, big paper stuffed in the toes. Little Sadie Flynn, silent since her mother's death, clutched her slate as if it might keep her warm. Clara lit the last of her kindling and pressed on. Arithmetic by candlelight, stories from Little Women, whispered against the rattling windows, her own hands numb while she wrapped Sadie's between hers. The fire died to ash, but she refused to stop. "I've got the key to my castle in the air," she read, voice shaking, "but whether I can unlock the door remains to be seen." That was when the schoolhouse door burst open, flinging snow across the floor. Thomas' roar filled the frame hat, dripping, white eyes hard. "School's closed," he said simply. Clara rose, startled, pride flaring hotter than the cold. "You don't decide that, Mr. Roar. I'm their teacher." He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, his voice firm but measured. Storms turned. "This building won't hold another night. I brought the wagon blankets, hot water. I already spoke to their families. They agreed." The children's faces lit with sudden hope, Polly already grabbing his books. Clara planted herself between them and the door. "You should have asked me first." Thomas met her eyes steady as a wall. "I did. 3 days ago. You just didn't listen." For a moment, the silence was louder than the wind outside. Her pride rose bitter as the frost, biting through her gloves. "I'm trying to keep them alive," she said, voice low but trembling. "So am I," he answered, softer now. The children shifted nervously. Sadie's wide eyes flicked between them. At last, Clara stepped aside, her shoulders rigid. The children filed out into the storm, bundled into the safety of Thomas's wagon. When he returned the next evening, the schoolhouse was empty, the desks bare. He stood in the center of the room, frost crawling up the window panes, and looked at her. "You'll freeze in that cabin," he said quietly. Clara lifted her chin, though her lips trembled. "I'll manage." He crossed the room in 3 long strides. "You won't, and you know it." Her pride made her hold his gaze, but the words cut sharper than the wind. She had clung to the silence of her empty cabin like armor, but Thomas's presence had begun to show her its cracks. Before he left, he turned once more at the door. "Stubborn's a strength, Miss Carrington," he said, "but out here it can kill." Then he was gone, leaving her alone with her fading fire in the echo of his warning. For the first time, Clara wondered if her resolve would indeed keep her alive, or if it would bury her beneath the snow. The storm had not let up. If anything, it had sharpened its claws. Snow pressed against the schoolhouse walls, rattling the panes, and the silence inside was heavy. Clara stayed late sweeping the floor when Thomas returned, not with his usual brusque words, but with something folded carefully in his coat pocket. He set the paper on her desk and slid it forward. "Room and board. Salary through the spring. You teach the ranch hands children here, where it's safe. Food, firewood, a roof that won't collapse in the wind." Clara blinked her fingers, hovering over the neat handwriting. The terms were generous, too generous. Her throat tightened. "Why me?" Thomas's gaze didn't waver. "Because you didn't quit when everyone else would have. And because they already trust you." Her pride bristled. "I don't need charity." He shook his head. "This isn't charity. It's partnership. You keep your independence. Your own quarters, your own say in the classroom. And when spring comes, if you choose to leave, you leave. No chains, no obligations beyond what you want to give." She held his words in the silence, the storm groaning against the walls. Partnership. The word was a balm, but also a risk. If she accepted it, meant admitting she could not survive alone. If she refused, it meant clinging to a pride that might well freeze her bones before the thaw. At last, she folded the contract with trembling fingers. "I'll think about it." Thomas only nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll be back in the morning." His voice was calm but resolute, like a man staking more than one claim at once. Then he stepped out into the storm, leaving a trail of snow in his wake. That night, Clara sat by her weak fire, the contract heavy in her lap. Thomas's coat still hung on the wall where James had left it, a reminder of promises broken by death. She stared at the flames until her eyes blurred the silence, pressing in around her, cold and merciless. Her lips moved before she could stop them, barely a whisper, into the emptiness. "Please." It was not a prayer for James to return, nor for pride to harden again. It was a plea for warmth, for grace, for the smallest chance at something she had not dared to name in months, the possibility of beginning again. The storm outside roared, but inside the whisper lingered like an ember refusing to die. The storm had eased, but the valley still wore its white shroud. Snow lay piled against fences, branches sagged heavy with ice, and the air cut cold enough to sting. Yet in the old ranch library, something new was being born. By morning, Thomas had kept his word. What once housed shelves of dusty books was now a classroom remade with purpose. Oil lamps glowed steady on the walls, casting golden light across a slate board hung neatly between two frosted windows. 10 desks, roughly crafted from repurposed crates, lined the room in 2 careful rows. It wasn't elegant, but it was warm, safe, and hers. Clara stood at the front, chalk in hand, hardly believing this space belonged to her. The sound of hooves soon broke the quiet, followed by laughter. The door banged open, and a gust of snow carried in 10 children, cheeks pink scarves trailing boots stomping the floor. They ranged from 6 to 12, rough around the edges, their coats patched, their slates worn. But their eyes shone with curiosity stronger than the cold outside. "You really a teacher?" one boy asked, his voice a mixture of doubt and awe. "I am," Clara answered softly, brushing the snow from his shoulder. A girl chimed in. "Ma says you used to teach in town." "I still do," she said, smiling faintly. "Only the room has changed." They clustered around, uncertain at first, then relaxed as Clara urged, "Sit wherever you like." The room filled quickly with chatter and laughter, with small hands clutching chalk and eager voices asking questions. For the first time since James's death, Clara felt the weight on her chest lighten. These children carried with them something she had thought gone: hope. By midday, the library was alive. She walked among the desks, guiding strokes on slates, praising efforts, learning names: Rosa, Joseph May, Samuel, and more. One drew a mare with a crooked hoof, another sketched the ranch house itself. Rosa, with careful lines, drew Clara by the blackboard, with a fire glowing behind her. Clara blinked hard, the sting of tears, unfamiliar yet welcome. Then the door opened again. Silence swept through the room as Thomas stepped inside, carrying a tray of bread, steaming stew, and mugs of warm milk. The children froze, reverence plain in their wide eyes. To them, he was more legend than man, the rancher who commanded herds and storms alike. "Eat," he said simply, setting the tray down. "Thank you, Mr. Roar," Rosa whispered. He nodded once and left without ceremony, his presence lingering even after the door shut. The children ate hungrily, some quietly splitting bread to share with others. Clara did not eat. Her hunger was of another kind, the ache of seeing life stir in a place she had feared would remain lifeless. When the room emptied at day's end, Clara stayed behind, wiping chalk from her hands. A knock sounded softer this time. Thomas entered, brushing snow from his coat. He set a folded bundle on her desk. "A blanket," he said. "Wool. Hand-stitched. Catherine made them." Clara's breath caught as she unfolded it, fingers tracing the neat patterns of red roses stitched into blue fabric. "She believed in warmth," Thomas said quietly, his gaze steady, "even for strangers." Clara wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The fire flickered low, but the warmth she felt now came from more than wool. It was memory, grief, and perhaps the first flicker of something new. Clara lingered by the fire long after the children had gone. The library turned classroom, hushed once more. The wool blanket lay heavy on her shoulders, its hand-stitched roses blooming in deep red against dark blue. She pulled it tighter, feeling the weight of its warmth seep past skin and bone, reaching places she had thought frozen solid. It wasn't just fabric. It was memory, a piece of another woman's love, stitched into every thread now resting against her. And in that moment, the ache she carried for James, the silence of her empty cabin, the sting of loss in every corner, seemed to ease just slightly. Her eyes drifted to the desk where Rosa's drawing lay forgotten. She picked it up carefully, smoothing the creases. The picture was simple, a child's hand guiding chalk across rough paper. Clara. At the blackboard, children gathered before her, a fire glowing bright behind. In the corner, Rosa had scrawled in uneven letters, "Our new teacher, she makes the cold go away." The words struck harder than the storm winds outside. Clara's throat tightened as she traced the crooked lines. To the girl, she wasn't just a teacher. She was warmth itself. For weeks, Clara had felt invisible, reduced to the echo of her grief and the gnawing emptiness of unpaid work. Yet here was proof as bold and innocent as a child's handwriting, that someone saw her not for what she had lost, but for what she still gave. The fire cracked gently in the hearth, and for the first time in half a year, Clara felt seen. She pressed the drawing to her chest, closing her eyes. Perhaps she didn't need to wait for spring for something to thaw. Perhaps it had already begun. The blanket warmed her shoulders, the paper warmed her heart, and together they quieted the old wound that had haunted every step since James's death. Healing, she realized, wasn't loud. It was quiet, like a soft ember refusing to go out, slowly gathering strength until it could burn again. When she opened her eyes, the room seemed different. The harsh edges of grief had softened, replaced by a fragile, unfamiliar peace. Beyond the windows, icicles still clung like daggers, the valley still drowned in white. Yet here inside, everything felt steady, even right. The classroom was no longer just a borrowed space. It was alive with possibility, laughter, still echoing faintly from the walls. Outside, winter held the valley in its iron grip. But within those walls, within herself, Clara discovered something stronger than the storm warmth that came not from firewood or wool alone, but from being needed, from being believed in. And as the day slipped quietly into night, she realized she was no longer merely enduring the winter. She was beginning slowly to outlast it. For once, everything was exactly where it belonged. The storm that winter hurled at Riverbend was not the one Clara feared most. It wasn't the white walls of snow or the icy winds that rattled windows. It was the storm that came from within a man's own body. One evening, as she crossed the yard, she saw Thomas stagger near the horse trough, his breath ragged, a cough tearing from deep inside his chest. She hurried closer, just as he pressed a sleeve to his lips. When he pulled it away, the wool was streaked with red. Clara's heart jolted. "Sit," she ordered, slipping under his arm, guiding his weight against her smaller frame. He tried to protest, muttering, "Just a cough," but the heat radiating from his skin betrayed him. She half led, half dragged him into the parlor, where she stoked the fire, high-fetched a basin, and pressed cool cloths against his burning forehead. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had done this before. "Don't argue, I know what this is." Her eyes did not waver when his tried to. "James, my husband, he burned the same way. 3 days from cough to coffin. I buried him with my own hands." The words shook, not from weakness, but from the memory carved into her bones. Thomas's fevered gaze locked on hers. His hands shot out, trembling but firm, catching her wrist. "I'm not him," he rasped. The strength of that simple sentence cracked something inside her. For months she had carried a vow: never again, never love, never watch another man fade in fire or frost. Yet here he was, gripping her hand with a stubbornness that refused to let her surrender to fear. She stayed with him through the night. She wiped sweat from his face, whispered nonsense just to tether him to the waking world, and fed him water when his lips cracked dry. Memories of James pressed close, but Thomas's presence pushed back, not replacing, not competing, only reminding her that grief did not have to be her only companion. When dawn bled pale light through the frost-glazed windows, his fever broke. His breath steadied. Clara slumped in the chair beside him, exhaustion blurring her eyes. He stirred, finding her there, her hand still in his. "I'm sorry," he whispered hoarsely, for what she asked softly, "for making you remember." She shook her head. "Some memories never leave, but you don't have to carry mine. You've got enough of your own." The silence between them was not heavy now, but shared a truce forged by firelight and endurance. He was not James. She was not bound to the past. And as the first true light of morning filled the room, Both knew they no longer needed to carry the other's burdens, only to walk beside them. When Thomas's fever finally broke the rhythm of life, on the ranch she shifted in subtle, yet undeniable ways. The children came bounding into the classroom with more laughter than before, their voices spilling into the rafters like sunlight through shutters. Clara noticed that their drawings had changed too. No longer were the pages filled only with cattle barns or snowmen. Now the sketches carried something new: community warmth, a sense of belonging. One afternoon, Rosa shyly handed Clara a picture. It showed her at the blackboard, chalk in hand, with a glowing fire behind her. But what caught Clara's breath was the figure standing beside her. Thomas, tall and steady, drawn with careful strokes. To the children, he was no longer just the distant rancher who brought bread and milk. He was part of their world and part of the fragile family they were all weaving together. Clara's eyes stung as she studied the paper. Somehow the children had seen what she herself had been afraid to admit. That evening, after the room had emptied and the silence of winter pressed back in, Clara found a small parcel resting on her desk. No note, no explanation. Inside lay a sturdy pair of boots, a pair of soft gloves lined with wool, and a slim book of poetry. She touched the leather cover gently, her fingers lingering on the embossed letters. Whoever had left it understood her needs perfectly, not just survival, but also comfort, beauty, and a reason to keep moving forward. Later, in her own room, Clara placed the gifts carefully in the drawer beside James's old pocket watch. The watch held memory. The gloves and book carried promise. For the first time, placing them side by side did not feel like betrayal. Instead, it felt like acknowledgement that she could honor the past while opening herself to what might come next. As she closed the drawer, her reflection in the frosted window looked changed. Not hollow, not burdened, but quietly alive. Winter still ruled the valley, but in her heart the thaw had already begun. The thaw of spring brought whispers just as sharp as any winter wind. In the marketplace of Riverbend, Clara felt them all around her. Women folding linens at the mercantile, men talking low behind barrels of flour. "She's still young, but living under a man's roof," one voice hissed. "And not wearing morning black anymore," another added with a click of the tongue. "It says enough." Clara kept her chin, high basket clutched tight, but each word pressed like stones into her chest. She had built her life on work and dignity, yet the world twisted her choices into scandal. By the time she returned to the ranch, shame had burned hot under her skin, not because of sin, but because gossip turned her resilience into weakness. That evening in the barn, Thomas found her pale and restless. "What happened?" he asked, his voice steady. Clara forced a smile, but her hands trembled. Finally, she admitted, "They say I've abandoned mourning, that I've taken what isn't rightfully mine. Your roof, your name, your protection." Thomas listened, jaw tightening. Then without hesitation, he reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper. It wasn't a love letter nor a plea. It was a contract. Clara opened it with cautious fingers. At the top, her name. At the bottom, his. The terms were startling in their clarity: a marriage recognized by law and society, but defined by her independence. She would keep her own room, full authority over the school, and freedom from any obligation she did not choose. "This is not charity," Thomas said quietly. "It's a shield. For you, for the children, for the classroom you've built. Let them say what they will. This will silence their tongues." Clara's throat tightened. He wasn't asking for her devotion, nor demanding her future. He was offering protection, a buffer between her fragile hope and the world's cruelty. For the first time, she realized Thomas wasn't just trying to rescue her. He was asking to stand beside her on her terms. And that, more than anything, made her feel seen. The marriage came quietly, without the spectacle the townsfolk loved to gossip about. No procession, no rings, no gathering of neighbors eager for scandal. It happened in the ranch house parlor, the fire snapping low and steady. A single Bible rested on the table. Reverend Whiteham stood solemnly, his breath misting in the chill air. Mrs. Chen, loyal as ever, acted as the sole witness, her eyes kind, as she nodded encouragement. Clara wore a plain green dress, the only one she owned that was not stitched for mourning, and Thomas stood across from her, steady as the beams that held the house together. They spoke the vows simply, voices even, but beneath each word trembled unspoken promises. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas did not rush to claim her. Instead, he leaned forward, gently brushing his lips against her cheek. It was barely more than a whisper of touch, yet it carried the weight of protection, respect, and the possibility of something tender growing between two souls who had both known loss. Clara felt her heart twist, half with fear, half with relief. For the first time since James's death, she was not carrying her burdens alone. That night in the quiet after the ceremony, Thomas returned with something small but unexpected, a clay pot cradling a young rose bush. Its branches were spindly, its roots thin, one tiny bud struggling against the cold. Clara blinked, startled. "It's not the season for roses," she whispered, fingertips grazing the fragile leaves. Thomas shook his head, his voice low but certain. "No, it isn't. But I thought maybe you were ready for something to grow." Her throat tightened at the words. Ready. She wasn't sure she was, but hope stirred anyway, fragile as the bud in her hands. She confessed in a rush. "I don't love you. I don't know if I can." Thomas did not flinch. Instead, he smiled softly, the kind of smile that steadied storms. "I'll wait," he said simply, "even if it never comes." Even then, Clara held the rose close, and in the dead of winter, she felt the first thaw deep inside her chest. Spring announced itself not with warmth, but with a single stubborn crocus pushing through the snow outside the classroom window. Its violet bloom trembled against the frost, fragile yet defiant. Clara paused mid-lesson, her hand resting on the slate as she stared at it. The sight struck her like a bell, clear, undeniable. For 2 months now, she had been signing her name as Clara Roar. At first, it had been only ink on paper, a shield Thomas had given her to quiet the town's cruel tongues. But now with the crocus breaking through ice, she realized the name had rooted inside her. It no longer felt borrowed, it felt chosen. It was time to stop pretending. That evening, as the children's sleds rattled back to their homes and the ranch yard quieted under the dimming sky, Clara found Thomas by the porch hauling sacks of seed. She stood before him, her hands trembling, not from the cold, but from what she had carried unsaid for weeks. "Thomas," she began, her voice catching. He looked up, brows knit in concern, but she pressed on. "I've been sleeping with your name for nearly 2 months, and I think it's time I stop pretending it doesn't matter." His expression shifted, confusion, giving way to something raw, as though he was bracing for pain. "What are you saying, Clara?" he asked. Her heart hammered, but the words came quiet and steady. "I love you. I didn't think I could after James. I swore my heart had been buried with him. But you," her voice cracked, "you've shown me I can live again." For a moment, the world held its breath. Then Thomas closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, cupping her face with hands both rough and gentle. "Say it again," he whispered, as though the words were water in a desert. Tears blurred her vision, but she smiled. "I love you, Thomas." Their lips met, hesitant, reverent. It was not passion's blaze, but the first warmth of thaw, the bloom of something long awaited. When they broke apart, Clara leaned her forehead against his chest and laughed softly through her tears. "And here I thought I was the one teaching lessons." Thomas chuckled, his arms tightening around her. "Seems we're both learning." Weeks later, April arrived, warm and uncharacteristically bright. The valley thawed, streams rushing with snowmelt, and life returned to Riverbend in green shoots and birdsong. Within the ranch house, Clara labored through the night with Thomas at her side, his hand never leaving hers. When the dawn finally spilled gold across the room, their son's cry broke through, fierce and alive. Clara wept with exhaustion and joy as she cradled the tiny red-faced boy against her chest. They named him James, called her Roar. James, to honor the husband she had once lost, called her Thomas's given name to honor the man who had stood by her in the storm, and Roar for the home they had built together. Clara kissed her son's brow, whispering, "You were born from winter, but you are made of spring." And Thomas, standing close with awe in his eyes, knew she spoke of more than the child. She spoke of all of them. The first bell of the spring term rang out across Riverbend Valley, its clear tone echoing like a promise. Children tumbled through the schoolyard gates, laughter spilling louder than the thawing creek. From the porch of the ranch-turned schoolhouse, Clara stood cradling her newborn son, his small head nestled against her shoulder. Beside her, Thomas rested, a steady arm across her back, drawing her close against the crisp breeze. For the children, it was the beginning of another school year. For Clara and Thomas, it was the start of something even greater, a life reimagined, a family remade out of loss and second chances. As the students' chatter filled the yard, Clara looked up at Thomas. His eyes, once shadowed with solitude, now held the warmth of a man who had chosen and been chosen in return. She leaned into him, whispering through the hum of the morning, "You waited." He pressed his forehead to hers, answering softly, "And it was worth every moment." The school bell tolled again, calling the children inside. Thomas reached for the door, but Clara lingered, her gaze on the crocus blooming by the steps and the tiny rose bush budding in her window. Winter had not taken everything. It had planted seeds. Together they stepped forward, Clara, Thomas, and the child in her arms, into a season not free of hardship, but full of chosen love. A love tended daily, resilient as spring itself, proving that, even from the hardest winter, something enduring can grow.